Welcome to Theology Curator, a podcast hosted by Kurt Willems and available online at theologycurator.com. Each episode looks at a theological, formational, or cultural theme. We might dig into the life and letters of a radical Jewish teacher named Paul, converse about a pressing contemporary issue, reflect on the nature of following Jesus today, or even attempt to remedy doom and gloom preaching with a good old-fashioned dose of hope. This show is an invitation to build bridges between the first century world of the earliest Christ followers into the 21st century reality we now inhabit. The Jesus we excavate from the rubble of tradition might just surprise us all.
I want to welcome you back to the podcast. I'm here with my friend Jared Byas, who I have not seen since we figured it out, 2011, but we've interacted over the years through Facebook and social media. And of course, I follow you and Pete and your podcast work and some of the stuff you've been doing. So it's really cool to have this sort of crossing of paths again. And we're doing this because you wrote a book called Love Matters More, How Fighting to Be Right Keeps Us from Loving Like Jesus. My friend Jared, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, it's great to be here. I am really glad. I was a little sad to remember that it's been 9 years, but yeah, I'm glad we can connect here.
No, totally. No, it's great, man. And, it's so fun to kind of follow your journey, and really when I saw that you had written a book and when I saw the cover, I was like, oh, this is going to be a special project, and one of the things that really excites me about a project like this is it's something I want to fight for. I want to fight for relationships. I want to fight for love. I want to fight for how can we be in this thing together and yet not neglect those things that make us unique as followers of Jesus. And that's hard to do. And as you know, we live in a very polarized and angry and loveless time. And so I'm looking forward to just diving in and seeing hearing some of your reflections on that. But that's a couple questions away. I think right now we need to know, who is Jared Byas? So Jared, my friend, tell us a little bit about your backstory, maybe, as far as your spiritual backstory, but also like how you end up. I know you've done some academic work, you've taught, you end up friends with Pete Enns along the way, you start a bunch of stuff, and now you've written a book. So catch us up a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. So I grew up in a small town in Texas. So my spiritual bio is Southern Baptist, but also my grandmother is a Native American kind of itinerant charismatic pastor. So she used to travel around in a van and minister to women in small towns in Texas. And so it was an interesting mix of this Southern Baptist and charismatic, but all within, a more Southern traditional evangelical way of reading the Bible and practicing our faith. Grew up very much in that early 90s Christian subculture, and then made my way to Liberty University and got a degree in philosophy and religion, and then up to Westminster Seminary. And, Westminster is where I had wanted to go since I was a teenager. I'm sure every 12 and 13-year-old young tyke wants to go get a PhD in presuppositional apologetics, which is kind of my
goodness. Dream. Wow. Yes.
So went up to Westminster and started getting pretty disillusioned at that point, just with some of the systems that were in place. And then eventually leaned more heavily into biblical studies, became a pastor for a number of years, taught at a university, taught some philosophy, some biblical studies. And that's where Pete and I really connected, wrote Genesis for Normal People, and kind of the rest has been history since then.
Yeah. And I remember Genesis for Normal People. Actually, I've recommended it many times because it's such a great sort of step into that book. And Pete's work has been really instrumental in the evolution conversation. And I feel like you coming alongside him, you guys together have kind of created something really cool because it seems like you complement each other in a lot of ways, but you still have sort of this foundational similarity when it comes to what you think of scripture and spirituality and stuff. So tell us about the Bible for Normal People and some of the work you guys have been doing and where that's going.
Yeah, so that our mission is to bring the best in biblical scholarship to everyday people. So that started with, I grew up in a time where there were Christian bookstores and there were all these resources out and about, but they weren't, say, from places like Harvard or Duke or Vanderbilt or these schools that I knew were doing that kind of work. And then you go to seminary and it just is an explosion of resources. And you're wondering, where was that in my church growing up? Where were these things? So we just that's our mission. That's our heart, is really to see how can we get these people. If you listen to our podcast, we don't tend to have people that you've maybe heard of. We'd want to get those really nerdy people who reluctantly come on the podcast to talk about their research on sin or, different books of the Bible, and really just kind of ask them to just extrapolate on what you've learned, because, we don't get this in a lot of other places. And so that's our mission. It's a podcast. It's been going on. We're in the midst of season 4 right now. But we really are, more than a podcast too. So we have all kinds of courses, and we have courses, we have book studies, we have all kinds of stuff going on. But it's all really based on that same mission.
Yeah, that's great, man. I know I benefit from it. I sometimes will find, I'll be, in my podcast app or whatever, and I always look for new episodes that come out, and I'll be like, topic sounds cool. Who is this person? You know what I mean? Right. And that's just beautiful because, I am someone who's kind of dabbled in biblical studies, but it's always cool, as in your field of study, you tend to get really narrow in the voices and the types of resources you listen to. So when all of a sudden you have some Jewish scholar that I've never heard of, talking about like cyanide and the covenant, I'm just like, oh, okay, this might actually be helpful. This is cool. So no, I really dig what you guys do. I recommend it all the time. And now here you are. Now you co-authored some resource with Pete. Is this your first solo book?
Yeah, it is. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, congratulations. That's really exciting.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So Love Matters More. Talk to me about that title. I mean, it's compelling, and so just in your face, but also just very simple. So tell us, what are you saying?
Yeah, I mean, it comes from, I keep coming back to the genesis really of the book is a class. When I was a pastor many years ago, there was a class that we had called For Skeptics Only. And it was for spouses of people who, their spouses believed, they were Christians. They knew that they wanted their kids to grow up in the church, but they didn't really buy it. They didn't buy the story. They weren't Christians, but they would come. And they wanted to be supportive. They wanted this to be a family thing on Sunday morning. So we had a class for them called For Skeptics Only. And I led that class, and it was just a great conversation. And it often went around talking about truth, and what do we believe and why do we believe it? So it was very heady and very kind of truth-based. And so originally this book was really about truth. And as I started kind of going down that route and down that through the rabbit hole, I kind of started saying, why are we so focused on truth? Why is it so much about what we believe? When I read the Bible, I don't see a big emphasis on making sure you check off the right beliefs. I see a different kind of emphasis. I see an emphasis on relationship and on love and on connection and loyalty and all these other things. And so then I started wondering, where did that breakdown happen? Where I would have never thought of that when I was growing up. And so I started thinking through my own experiences and how much my tradition focused on what we believe. And you were given the accolades and the affirmations when you won the sword drill and you could find the Bible verse, or when you could recite the creed, or when you could spit out this answer to why this, theological conundrum or question was there. And there wasn't a lot of uplifting and affirming and amplifying the voices of compassion and love and relationship and connection. It was a lot of head stuff and not a lot of heart stuff. So that for me is kind of my own story. I'm sort of preaching to myself with that title, that love matters more. Yeah,
I think that's the experience of a lot of people, a lot of evangelical leading Christians, right, have grown up in this culture where truth is a capital T, and it's something that we have to stand for, right? And I'm not going to put words in your mouth, but my guess would be you have things that you believe are true about reality. You may say, I might be wrong about what I believe is true, but you have things, I have things that I believe are true. I believe Jesus is the Son of God. I believe in resurrection, right? There are things that we can believe that are true, but it's the more and more I go on this journey with God and with community, I'm just realizing that this Western phenomenon of head knowledge that's not somehow translated into body and soul and the fullness of who we are is causing a lot of harm to ourselves, to our neighbors. And I think love may be part of the, for lack of a better word, the antidote, right? Like it's something that may compel us through truth into something more. And so, talk about some of the, like, who are you hoping reads a book like this?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, my target audience really is people who have this inclination, who have this intuition, this feeling that love matters more, that something that they grew up learning about just didn't sit well with who they were, but they sort of have played the game over the years. And now I think there's a new breath of fresh air. I feel like there's a new permission in a lot of churches to kind of say, hey, there are other ways of expressing our faith and embodying our faith. And so I hope this is just one tool, hopefully among many, to give people that permission to say, if you've had this intuition, but you didn't know exactly how to articulate it, and you feel a little insecure in stepping out in faith to say, hey, you know what? I get that you're super smart and you have all this stuff and good for you, but my path in my faith is going to be this way. I'm hoping this gives a little bit of a roadmap for that. Yeah,
no, that's awesome. That's awesome. And so jump into the content of the book a little bit. Like, do you have, I can imagine a phrase like "speak the truth in love" may pop in there, right? And so talk to us about how this actually works itself out without, obviously, like, we're going to read the book. So I always tell authors, like, you don't have to dictate.
That's the caveat. I'll say as much as you want, as long as you all promise to buy it.
That's right. That's right. And, listeners of this podcast are faithful book buyers, we hope. So we'll see. But yeah. So what sort of anchors your book as you sort of take folks on a journey?
Yeah, I think there are really 3 verses in the Bible that anchor the whole book. The first, for sure, is speaking the truth in love, because I've just seen that be used as a weapon. So that's sort of my entry into this whole book is, what does it mean to speak the truth in love? And why, in my tradition, has the emphasis always fallen on the truth telling and not the loving in that phrase? Yeah. So for me, it was only ever used in the context when I had to say something about my opinion and why you were wrong. That was the only time that was ever used. And so this book is me unpacking that phrase. And then there are 2 other verses that I think were really helpful. One is in John 8:32, when he says, you shall know the truth and the truth will set you free. And I think that, for me, had an interesting twist for me through that. And then, Jesus saying, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And so within these 3 passages, just started, really what it did is force me to go back to the Bible and say, well, what does the Bible actually say about truth? Yeah. And I was pretty surprised to go through. So I went, as every nerdy person would do, it sat down and found every instance of the Hebrew word translated truth, every instance of the Greek word, and just looked at the context and said, what's it actually talking about here? And very, very rarely, only on 1 or 2 occasions, could I point to it being something like a belief in your head that's accurate. Yeah. But all of the hundreds, dozens and hundreds of other times that the word is used, it's used in these much more embodied and relational contexts.
Yeah. No, that seems so consistent with what we know of ancient people, what we know of the ancient, like, Hebrews and Israelites and, post-exiles and Jesus. I mean, it just seems like it's everywhere, but there's something about us as we approach the Bible that is like, that's nice, but what's it really saying? We always want what's it really saying, right? Right. And maybe, words like mystery just freak people out, Right? Yeah.
Well, and it's hard in this environment, right? So it's interesting the time that we live in to be writing a book that says love matters more, with the implication, as you read the book, that it matters more than truth seeking.
Yeah.
But we live in a time where that's a scary thing to say because we have conspiracy theories and we have everyone just kind of making up whatever they think is the truth. And if I Google it for 3 minutes, then it's right. And it's sort of like, I don't want that to get misconstrued that's the direction that I'm endorsing.
Right.
That truth still does matter. It's just not the end goal.
Right.
And so I think things get turned sideways when we mistake the goal for the map.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. And that image just works. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And it's fascinating too, of course. God is love. People point this out all the time. I don't know that we always take it past ideas, unfortunately, right? And I'm not saying no one does. I'm just saying it's been a tendency to even take things like God is love and then figure out how to fit that in our systematic theology, right? How do we fit that into the category? Because he's also wrathful and God is also, just and all of these things. And it just seems really fascinating that anytime some Christians, including myself at one point in my life, are confronted with these like empathic parts of God, they fit when we're in crisis. But when it comes to defending our faith, which is a terrible phrase, but when it comes to defending our faith, it's as though they're categories to put somewhere. But ultimately, it's really just about, can I defend the historicity of the resurrection, Mosaic authorship? Oh, gosh. I'm trying to think. It's hard to even think that way because it's been a while since I've been in that zone. But these are the things a lot of people grow up with. And then they come to my church. They become friends with you. They listen to your podcast or mine. They're doing things. They're trying to grab for things. And many of them just are like, man, this is so much different than what I grew up with that I don't even know how to reconcile this idea of God at all. And many just step away. Right. And it's like the church unknowingly just is really good at pumping out atheists and later in life, And it's just fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you mentioned earlier the West. I feel like Christians, more conservative, I'd say maybe evangelical Christians, are more Western than even people in the West. Like, I feel like the West has started to actually move away from some of those dogmatic things, and evangelicalisms are the ones that like holding on to that. Because it is hard, because it's such, you're swimming in the water of Western thought processes. It's not just a set of belief, it's a whole system that kind of you're swimming in, and you don't even recognize that you emphasize thinking over embodiment. Like, wouldn't even know that because you've never seen anything different. So
and it seems interesting because tools like the Enneagram, right, would say that there's this whole third of humans that actually instinctually go to their body before anything else, but they're trained not to. Right. It's just fascinating that, and whatever someone might think of the Enneagram, I don't think it's far-fetched to say that some people are driven by instinct more than their mind. But the church comes along and says, hey, don't listen to all of those other parts of you. Let me tell you what you should think. And it's like we just dissect people. Right. And that is, you're right, like just so Western. And so like when you think of these situations, like what gives you hope? Like what are you noticing? Like not every church is like the church you grew up in or the church culture I grew up in, right? 90s youth group culture, whatever you want to call it, which I actually like, there is so much treasure that I still like hold from those moments as well. Like, it's not like I burnt it all down. It's more like, but I also would have thought this if I stayed on that track. And I don't like the person I would have been if I would have not sort of let some of that stay where it was. So what are some signs of hope that you're finding as you think about this theme?
Well, I mean, the easy answer is, congregations like you guys and others that I've been invited to be a part of, and all the stories we hear from the Bible for normal people, this is a growing, it's not just a growing concern. I think, 8-9 years ago when we were at Solarize, I heard a lot more of this language of deconstruction. And there are still plenty of people going through that. Sure. But I feel like 8 or 9 years ago, that was like the cutting edge. Like everyone on the journey, if you were at the front of the line, so to speak, you were in that phase.
Yeah.
And now to see more and more people come out the other side, kind of through the fire, and it's now refined, and their faith is more personal to them, and it's more real to them than it's ever been. And churches are starting to spring up that has as the centerpiece Jesus and an ever-evolving understanding of Jesus, an ever-evolving understanding of love. But that's sort of that center set that we're all just kind of orbiting around, rather than this, bounded set of you can't come in here unless this, or you're excluded, or who's in, who's out. I see that more and more. And what's hopeful is not only that I see it more and more, I feel more and more people are compelled by that way of thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. And centered and bounded definitely is a big deal. When you place Jesus at the center of a community, there's just so much more room for air. You can breathe. You can mess up next to your neighbor, and they can come alongside and say, "Hey, let me help you reorient towards something that's more beautiful, that matters more than your idea, your ideology, your politics that's distracting you, whatever it is, it's distracting you." So yeah, what a great reflection. And you're absolutely right. I tell a lot of people that deconstruction is necessary for many people. I want to steward spaces that I've been invited into where people are doing that, because it matters that they feel safe to do that hard work. But man, what a tragedy it is for me, from my perspective. And I respect people for whom this has been their story. But for me, it's like, man, it's so sad that people have had such a bad experience with Christianity that they deconstruct out of Jesus. They can't find this love that you're talking about because there's too much of the other stuff that is attached consciously and subconsciously to even get there, at least for the season they might find themselves in. And yet I'm hopeful with you that a new sort of wave of, no, we can shed some of that stuff, but there's something else to be built that is more beautiful than we thought. So thanks.
Well, I mean, not to be nerdy about this, but I feel like your podcast may be one place where I can go here. It's just saying, I don't actually like, and I've given up, it's okay. We use language how we use it, but I don't like that we use the word deconstruction for that process, because if you understand what that means within the philosophies in which it actually originated, what you're talking about is just destruction. That's just destruction.
It's
what's
violent.
The difference between deconstruction and deconstruction is deconstruction has it built in there, the con that we're constructing in the midst of the deconstructing. And I like that, because for me, deconstruction is a very life-giving, liberating way of being in the world. I'm constantly destructing those things that are not bringing life and constructing those things that are. And that tension of the deconstruction is exactly where I want to be the rest of my life. That's a beautiful thing. But it's whenever we overemphasize the D and end up destructing, or we don't question ourselves and we end up just constructing ideology. I think that's where we have a trouble. So I like that tension of the deconstruction.
Oh, I love that. I've never thought of it. I mean, the way you're explaining it is just, it's grabbable, I think, for people, right? Like, there's the kind of disillusion of certain, the destruction almost of these things that have held us back, but there's the construction of something that we may never have seen before. That's awesome, man. And, so as you're walking this book through and you're walking people through that journey in their own way, talk to me about the kinds of things that you are, cluing into in your book about where love matters more, that people just really seem not to have kind of, at large grabbed a hold of.
Well, I think, there's really two things. Maybe I would say they're kind of unrelated, and I hope I remember the second one when I get to it.
That's fine.
But the first, I take a few chapters to really walk through implications for how we read the Bible. There's a hermeneutical implication for love mattering more. And I start that with the idea that love changes God's mind And we see this in the text. We see where God changes God's mind in arguments with Abraham and in these other passages. Jesus seems to be changing the meaning of Scripture in the Sermon on the Mount.
Yeah.
You have heard it said, but I say to you. And that's fulfillment. That fulfillment is a changing of the meaning of the text. And what's guiding Jesus, I would say, is this hermeneutic of love. So if we see God doing it, we see Jesus doing it, and then I say, well, by implication, maybe we should be doing this. Maybe we should have the lens of love, that's our hermeneutical lens through which we decide what parts of the Bible we emphasize and what parts we de-emphasize and what parts sort of help us understand other parts. And so there's these hermeneutical implications, I think, to what it means for love to matter more. Because when we say telling the truth in love, we set it as this their intention with one another. That the Bible, the truth quote of the Bible, is in tension with my culturally conditioned impulses to love.
That's excellent. Yeah.
And so I think I want to overturn that and say, no, love, there's what the words on the text, and then there's love as the lens through which we can read all of it. They're not in tension. But we have to be willing to let go of some of these idols maybe that we've held on to, or these sacred cows.
Yeah. Yeah. So on this point, it's really interesting because what you just expressed is our lens will often lead us to think, like a passage like that, love is the concession. Love is the thing that's like culturally appropriate. In our world, if you're soft, you're weak, you're whatever label you might put, but it's not like in Scripture. The writers are reflecting that Jesus is like, well, you can have your love stuff as long as I'm true. It's they can't be pulled apart.
Right.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. That's good. That's good. Yeah.
And then the second, which would be for me, the implication of that too, is people will say, oh, okay, so love is the lens. So what makes it, so then we can just make the Bible mean whatever we want it to mean. Right? That's kind of the implication of that. It's like, no, you're not listening. Love is the lens. Love is the guide. So we have to, but then what is love? Okay. Now that's a good conversation. I'd rather have that conversation. I think it's an important one. It's beyond the scope of this book, but I think it's an important one. But for me, I do give a little hint, and I talk about the changing tides starting with slavery and into women in leadership and into being affirming with LGBTQ. And I don't necessarily make the case in any sort of biblical way, because again, that's kind of the point. Is what matters is the lens through which we're reading the Bible. And if you took a different lens, you come to a different conclusion. And so I more trace how the tides have turned in terms of just popular opinion. And I talk about the Spirit of God. And how does the Spirit of God work in our culture and in our churches? And are we willing to trust these trends? It's interesting to me, we were willing to trust it with slavery. When we hit a tipping point and everyone's like, oh, that's bad. And now we would never even consider the arguments that were made 140 years ago by pastors in Southern churches. And then with women, we had the same. And for a lot of denominations, that's become a tipping point. Like, why are we even talking about this? Now when I read the Bible, the only lens I can see it is an affirming women in leadership, against slavery. But we have to realize historically, that's not the case.
Right.
And so I feel like I make the point just small. I don't spend a lot of time, but I think culturally we're in this moment where we're close to that tipping point for, affirming our LGBTQ brothers and sisters. And here's a few ways that we can read the Bible through that lens of love.
Interesting. Yeah. No, absolutely. And it is very fascinating. I mean, I remember years ago, William Webb's book on this, right? And
I had that in mind a lot. Yeah.
Oh, sure. The redemptive.
Short, right?
He kind of affirms two of those three, right? And it looks as though you're saying, wait a second, what if, right? And I think it's interesting because, not everyone who hears this is going to be affirming per se of LGBTQ people. But, okay, so the lens of love, what does it mean for at least your, number one, posture towards, number two, relationships with, number three, views of society, right? Because I think often we kind of jumble around like, like anyone does, right? We're swimming in this political culture. We're swimming in this sort of Americanism of sorts. And when we're faced with an issue, sometimes it's hard to sort out which ones are specifically for my tribe and specifically for the world, and I would imagine that the lens of love, if someone can't quite get to that progressive hermeneutic, would at least say, do everything you can to see them as human. Do everything you can to see them flourish. Do everything you can to see them free to be who they are as image bearers, and for so long, and this was true with slavery. This is true with women, right? I'm not a historian, but I can imagine so many Christian pastors saying, we can't let our women vote. We can't let women do these things. We can't let them work outside the home because God. And it's like, the lens of love at least says, even if you're going to be complementarian in your church, that you cannot be the kind of person who restricts, people from living out what is.
Yeah. I think that lens of love is a really good phrase because, what the most haunting verse for me over the last few years has been the Sermon on the Mount, not the Beatitudes, but this other part where Jesus says, listen, be like my Father, and my Father's perfect. And you know how my Father acts? God gives rain to the just and the unjust, and the sun shines on the righteous and the unrighteous, and be like that. So for me, there is no discernible difference in how God behaves toward those who are doing the right things and making all the right choices, and those who are doing the wrong things and making all the wrong choices. And that's such a damning thought for my life to say, if someone had a video camera and looked at how I behave toward people, would you be able to tell based on how I'm acting, those good people versus who I think are not the good people? And if you can, that is not acting like God. That is not, for me, a lens of love. And so I agree. There is this step where I would hope eventually people get to that affirming place, but that's stage 3. And I feel like some people will use telling the truth in love as a way to cover over their disgust and their discomfort with people's life choices. And so I would hope we could at least get to that point where we can see that that's maybe not the most loving way we can behave toward people, even if we aren't there yet.
Yeah, it seems that, Jesus's call to even love enemies would be a call to not have the capacity to see your neighbors with disgust. Now, could there be things that are outright harming others? Sure. Is it these relationships? No. That's the kind of thing we have to get better at discerning. What are the impulses? If I was told my entire life that this particular kind of person, and maybe it's LGBTQ, but it could be all kinds of different types of persons, as we know throughout history.
Republican.
Right. It could be any of these categories. If I'm told from the day I'm born until I'm in my early 20s that these are the kinds of people that are not like us, they are ruining A, B, and C about the world. We've got to ask ourselves a question. Are my impulses like Christ? Who does Jesus encounter that he postures himself that way towards? Well, some might say almost at times religious leaders, maybe, right? But not the woman at the well, not the tax collectors, not the common people,
and not the Samaritan.
Right,
who actually ends up being the hero of the story, scandalously enough.
Exactly. And so I think this conversation, I would say a resource like this, you make that point. If you're affirming, it's going to give you some more sort of like resources for like wrestling and understanding that view. And if you're not, maybe it gives you something to both challenge your lens and to ask what parts of these impulses for you are just straight up Bible and what parts of these are ingrained in us, whatever those issues may be. And I love that about the direction and vision you've just cast here. So tell us a bit more about, we've got a couple of minutes. Tell us a little bit more about the process. I'm always interested in what was it like writing this? I mean, you talk about how you came into this, you're part of this group, and you're in a place where you're like, this group opened me up to this need for seeker truth stuff, and skeptic is a better word. And now you have this book. Talk to us about the journey you sort of went on internally, and anything else that feels kind of relevant to the creation of this project.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first part was my own personal evolution in recognizing that love didn't matter more to me for a long time. So this book is a book that I needed to hear 10 years ago, for sure. So I had to go on my own journey. So this is really me preaching to myself and hopefully reflecting the changes I've gone through in my own life, for sure.
Yeah.
And then through that, it's just a matter of then how do you translate that into an accessible resource for people who, I'm a very, I'm a closeted nerd. So how I came to this was through not the normal route, but more through reading philosophy and all these other things. So it's sort of how do we make these things accessible? And so that's been the process. And as far as technically, it was a grueling process.
Oh yeah, I know that feeling.
Oh man, goodness, yeah. So
no, absolutely. By the way, so I turned in my final draft to my book like 3 weeks ago. So I kind of can imagine your process. Tell me, so it releases what, September 8th? Is that?
Yep.
Yeah,
that's right.
September 8th. Okay. So how long ago did you give your last go through your words and just say, okay, Zondervan, that's all I realize I'm not allowed to touch this anymore. Like how long ago has that been?
Oh, what year is it? 2020. It's like pandemic time, so it's hard for me to reflect.
Yeah.
I would guess that would have been around April of 2019. So
wow,
almost a year and 3 months ago or so.
Wow.
Yeah.
So they've had your words for a while, and has that been? Talk to me about that. Some people who create that are probably listening. People who write, like, talk to us about the distance. Is there still? I'm sure. There were multiple emotions that kind of emerged within you through that. And it sounds to me like you actually get a lot of joy out of what I'm holding in my hand, this advanced reading copy, but the final copy, like I can imagine there's a lot of joy at this point, but what's that been like?
Yeah. I mean, it's that insecurity of putting your heart and soul into something and then realizing, one, recognizing this is your first book, so it's not going to be the best thing you're ever going to create in your life. But then being hopeful, and I would just say also just finding a lot of relief and gratitude with people who have advanced reading copies and saying this is helpful because I firmly believe in the message. I'm a little shaky on did it come across in the way I would want it to. My hope is just that people hear the message and can look past the foibles and mistakes of a young writer and all that jazz. So there's that insecurity there, and I have to say, just because I'm in the midst of it right now, but promoting yourself is like cuts against the grain of everything in my being, and it's the most exhausting part. Is like. You're fighting the ego that kind of wants to, and then fighting the other part of you that's like, and then parting the other part that's like, what if I promote this thing and it's not very good? Like, how does that work? So it's just such a mix of like self-doubt and all that stuff. So.
Sure. No, I can relate a little earlier in the process, but I understand. And you've had some people come alongside though who have said, we affirm this work. Who are some of those voices who have endorsed the project and you've really appreciated?
Yeah, well, Pete, of course, he's always a great cheerleader and really appreciate everything that Pete's meant to me and done alongside me. So, but then, there's, Carolyn Custis James has been a big person that I've appreciated. She lives in the area here as well, near us. And Pete and I live like 10 or 15 minutes down the road from each other. So,
cool.
Yeah, so that's been good. And, Jonathan Merritt and just a few other folks that have been helpful. And I appreciate Jonathan just because he's a good writer. That's
he is.
nice.
He's gifted.
Yeah, so folks like that, and just a bunch of. For me, it's more important though that it's the average people that I'm trying to reach, and so
absolutely.
we have a launch team of 100 and something people, and getting some feedback from them has been really great too.
That's awesome, man. Well, I'm really excited for you. This is a huge deal. And the book is called Love Matters More: How Fighting to Be Right Keeps Us from Loving Like Jesus. Talk to us. So it's September 8th is the big day. So pre-orders are ready right now. Just go to Amazon. What else do you want us to know? This is your chance to do the thing that feels weird and promote the heck out of your book. So what do we
I would
need to
just
know?
say, would really appreciate, you can go to lovemattersmorebook.com if you'd like. If you do pre-order, I would say I put together a 3-part series on how to talk to people you disagree with.
Yeah.
And so it's just little tips and tricks I've learned over the years. I facilitate a lot of these conversations between family members and friends who disagree fundamentally on things, but need and want to stay in close relationship. And so it's just really practical tips and things. So you can go to lovemattersmorebook.com. If you pre-order it, you can download those, and hopefully that's helpful too.
Yeah, no, that's great. Well, Jared, thanks so much for being with us. I look forward to seeing this book, do some great things in local church communities and in people's lives. So glad that you're on the show. I'm glad that you wrote the book, man.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. Appreciate it, Kurt.
You bet.
Thanks for listening to Theology Curator. For more resources from Kurt Willems, check out theologycurator.com/newsletter to sign up for our email update list. For new listeners of the podcast, we hope you will subscribe via iTunes, Google, or your podcast manager of choice. If you like what you hear, please leave the show a review. For regular listeners, consider supporting Kurt's online ministry at patreon.com/Kurt Willems. Lastly, please don't let this conversation end when the episode is over. We hope you feel empowered in regular life to explore theology and faith in intelligent and humanizing ways.